I'd like to thank Alexis and all of the organizers for inviting me, but it's been a very smooth conference and it's been a great conference. The theme of my paper today is going to be the theme of the genocide as expressed in modern Armenian American literature of the 20th century in the English language. Now, the inception of modern Armenian American literature in English can be traced to two works appearing almost simultaneously: Leon Sarabian Harold's only published book of poems, This Waking Hour, in 1925, and William Saroyan's The Daring Young Man on the Flying Trapeze in 1934. Harold's poetry predated the later, more famous Saroyan's work by almost a decade, and more importantly, the focus of Harold's first poem is the aftermath of the Armenian genocide. Thus, from its very inception, it can be argued that the genocide has played an important role in the formation of Armenian American literature. 2015 marks then not only the 100th anniversary of the Armenian genocide, but also the 90th anniversary of Armenian American literature. And during that 90-year period, a multitude of writers writing in English emerged, especially in the United States, whose works reflected the variety of themes and influences on American literature in general, but also to specific references to the genocide. It was primarily survivors of the Armenian genocide who immigrated to the United States, adding to the already existing Armenian community estimated to be approximately 66,000 in 1914. They arrived with a common identity, a shared sense of peoplehood based on their Christian origins, a common language with its unique alphabet and literature, and a cultural history of close to 3,000 years. Wherever the survivors established themselves, the genocide had a significant and continuing impact on their lives, often reflected in literature. Armenian authors at first produced an Armenian literature in the Armenian language, especially in the genres of memoir and autobiography. The genocide was a central experience in the lives of survivors, and therefore was a major theme in these genres, which expressed their memories and feelings and the overwhelming sense of loss. We just heard from Lawrence Sherinian's paper, but he's also a very excellent literary critic, and he put it this way, quote, "For Armenian diaspora writers, the genocide still appears to be the context and background for much of their work. It always seems to be there in the diaspora texts, either directly as an allusion, as an image, or as an underlying metaphor. Loss, exile, dislocation, alienation, ethnic marginality, disempowerment, and continuing trauma are just some of the central themes of this literature. Perhaps in time this will change as the Armenian diaspora reconceptualizes itself," end quote. The first generation of Armenian writers writing in English, writers like Leon Sarabian Harold, Levon Zaven Sermelian, Peter Suryan, Marjorie Hosepian, Harry Barba, Richard Hagopian, produced works on a variety of themes, but each touched on the Armenian genocide. In the dedication to Leon Sarabian Harold's first and only book of poems, This Waking Hour, Harold says, quote, "To those disinherited of life in 1915, this is a hill, a flag," end quote. And letters uncovered in his archive, located today at the University of Wisconsin, clearly describe the horrors of the Armenian genocide, thus making the tie to Harold's own work. The poem I put up there, it's small to read, and I'm not going to read it, but it regards his ancestral village of Put Arinj, and that's his first poem, and it's dedicated to the memory of that village. And memory plays an extremely important role in his work, as that is all that is left for him to work with in his literature, and therefore his work becomes a search for what had been his life before. Another writer is Richard Hagopian, who captured the spirit and feeling of the Armenian immigrant in his three works, The Dove Brings Peace, Far Away the Spring, and Wine for Living, that while they do not necessarily directly address the Armenian genocide, they do touch on the inevitable consequences of the disaster on the Armenian family and on the Armenian people. For those who survived the genocide, life was a struggle to accommodate themselves in a culture alien to them. Language, culture, traditions were different. What was it like to be raised in a family where the genocide was the spoken or unspoken backdrop to life? What was it like to be raised in a family where the first language was Armenian and thoughts were of the home country, while at the same time the child was going to public school in America and learning about a very different culture? How was this to be reconciled? Hagopian, in his work Far Away the Spring, weaves a story of Armenian immigrant life in America told through the eyes of an Armenian family in Boston. The immigrant life was filled with difficulties, but the immigrant emerges with dignity and redeeming qualities. In his short story, The Burning Acid, combines both the memory of the genocide and the experiences of an immigrant living in the United States. The burning acid in the title is the emotion and pain engendered by the genocide that ate away at the survivors and reached their children's generation. His searing portrait of the human toll of the genocide on the survivors is unforgettable. Through the main protagonist, Berge, he also explores the father-son relationship and what the father can transmit to his son. Berge undergoes an awakening when he serves in battle in World War II, and death, which is so welcome for the older generation of Armenians, is everywhere in the battle, and Hagopian uses the war to communicate his message of hope. The most celebrated writer of the first period in Armenian American literature is clearly William Saroyan, whose works generally have a more optimistic outlook. In his short stories and plays, he often looked through the eyes of a child at the world. He was not happy with the organized institutions in the world, such as the church. And while he perhaps never directly mentions the genocide in his work, his abhorrence of war could be attributed to his own feelings about the genocide. Although born in the United States, he must have heard about it often from his parents of the loss of life and destruction of their ancestral homeland of Armenia. Saroyan did express an element of alienation in his work as he explored his own place in the New World, especially in the short story, Countrymen, How Do You Like America?, which looks at the life of an Armenian immigrant to the United States by the name of Sarkis of Gultik. Gultik is a small village outside Bitlis, which was the ancestral homeland of Saroyan. Sarkis, from his very first moments in the new country of America until the later years when he settled down, married, and had children, and although he had lived in America for many years, Sarkis still feels that he is not completely at home in his adopted country. Saroyan faced prejudice and discrimination in Fresno because of his Armenian ethnicity, spent 5 years in an orphanage after losing his father at age 3. That experience of living in the orphanage reinforced in him the already existing feelings of alienation and not fitting in. Other second-generation Armenians express this element of alienation, more specifically a feeling of being between two worlds, as they explore their own place in the new world, thus becoming less important an issue for third-generation writers born and raised in the United States. Leon Sermelian also expressed a theme often repeated in Armenian American literature, that he was both a part of an Armenian world and an American world. Quote, "Poetry might well heal the inner split and bring my disparate selves together and make me whole again. This was my basic problem, how to be whole again," end quote. The first generation of writers who wrote in English, like Saroyan and Hagopian, articulated the feelings of those who had grown up in America. Myron Simon, in his quote, work Ethnic Writers in America, says that ethnic writers, quote, "found themselves adrift between two worlds, no longer at home in the one, not really welcome in the other. Thus they increasingly felt a sense of their separateness, felt betrayed by the social values they had embraced," end quote. These writers lived in tension between their Armenian self-identity, experienced in their homes, and their lives under American influence, felt in American society at large. They were influenced by the way American society looked at immigrants and upon ethnics. These feelings also engendered alienation. Alienation, quote, "is a feeling of insecurity arising from one's awareness that one's once firm ties to others, to geographic places, to traditions and beliefs had been cut," end quote. This form of hybrid expression between two cultures is very strong and is often represented in the literature of many different groups who came to America. Social changes in the United States. The first period spanned the era of the formation of the Armenian diaspora and the communities that lived in the United States. These were the first-generation Armenians who had shared that commonness of background. However, in the 1960s and 70s, great changes came to American culture, with the anti-war movement as well as the social rebellion stemming from perceived prejudice and/or segregation. Khachik Tololian, in speaking about William Saroyan, mentions that the conflicting pressures upon which Saroyan worked could not be fully expressed until the last several decades of his life. The greater freedom due to the greater social changes that took place in America allowed for the change in literary approach. And these changes had important consequences on an ethnic community, and in the case of the Armenians, as well as other ethnic groups living in the United States, this has been especially true with the changes taking place in the 60s and 70s having the greatest impact. My paper talks a little bit about the 60s and about the crucial impact of all of the major social changes that take place. Among those was the civil rights movement, which led to a change in the perception of what it meant to be American, and who could be included in the concept of being American. Ethnic groups gained a greater sense of self-awareness and appreciation of the contribution of all groups to America. The term ethnic group is not used narrowly to only refer to African Americans or Asian Americans, but even ethnic groups of European origin became more self-aware. There was a growing pride in attachment to ethnicity and to identity. No longer was being in the minority, or in the case of the Armenians, an ethnic group, a hindrance in achieving various political, economic, and social goals towards equality of opportunity. Peter Balakian asserts that it was in this same period when there was an intellectual and political culture that had an understanding of trauma, survivor experience, and the importance of cultural memory that allowed the Armenian American experience to become fully expressed. All of these changes affected the broader American culture first, and gradually Armenians were influenced as well. Literary works such as Alex Haley's Roots and Michael Arlen's Passage to Ararat in 1975 were the breakthrough novels in the rising awareness of ethnic identity. These works featured writers who were searching for their own identity by delving deep into their family history. And the 1970s were to see an ever-increasing number of literary works produced by many different ethnic groups. These works included that present themselves after 1975 reflect in general the renewed interest in self-discovery, in finding and identifying one's roots, and speaking about issues that may have little been discussed within the family. Michael Arlen's Passage to Ararat was the groundbreaker in this period, exposing the centrality of the genocide as a focus on the recovery of identity. The genocide became a vehicle for self-awareness, for an understanding of one's parents and the trauma that they had endured, and about the understanding of how one's identity played into it. Peter Demirdjian is one of the writers who I focus on a lot in my paper. In 1986, he wrote his novel called Daughters of Memory, which is part of a trilogy where the genocide is living within him in the person of his mother. She is very open and direct about the history that she endured, and he is constantly aware of the genocide in her conversations, especially with her friends. Memory and its perception are the tools used by the author as he explores the genocide as his constant companion and seeks to understand how it affected his and his family's life. Critics such as Lawrence Sherinian, earlier mentioned, and Margaret Bedrosian have also commented on Daughters of Memory from the perspective of a novel that reflects what is called the collective symbol of the genocide in literature. And while acknowledging the role of genocide, I also examine the role of art and imagination in the context of the formation of an identity in a longer written version of this same presentation. Writing in 1986, Peter Demirdjian articulates the crucial matter of how the Armenians in America view himself, herself, and his ancestors. And he writes with an urgency and a compelling voice, and his words seem instinctively to be able to convey powerful images. Daughters of Memory is a continuation of his earlier works, Voyages and Wash Me On Home, Mama. Another writer from this period, a little bit later, is Micheline, Aharoni, and Markham, whose 2001 novel, Three Apples Fell from Heaven, explores a family living in historic Armenia and then follows them through the horrors of the genocide. Anagil's story concludes with her survival and life in Beirut. Markham's characters must struggle with identity throughout the novel, as does Markham herself, since her own grandmother was raised in a Turkish family, and she is constantly aware of both her Armenianness and her differentness from American society, and also her adopted family's attempts to acculturate her to a foreign way of life. Markham, who is accustomed to living in the United States, must also face the challenge of recognizing her own identity and to understand how the journey she has taken in writing the novel will help bring clarity to her own life. Another writer is David Demirdjian, whose work Asking the River is a novelette by one of the most prolific of Armenian writers writing in English in America. And his work captures the Armenian experience and the difficult adjustments required to come to terms with life in America. Along with his other works, it explores the impact of the genocide and how that theme became extremely important for later writers. Diaspora is also central to Demirdjian's sense of identity, as it was to his family. Although the genocide is not explicitly referred to early in the book, it is certainly the reason that his family had left their homeland. Having to establish roots in a country gave his family a lifelong feeling of fear and insecurity, and Mugrechian shared his family's sense of living in exile, the palpable sense of potential persecution. And I read from the PowerPoint. In reference to his mother, he says, quote, "She was a foreigner, but I was an American, or rather an Armenian American. Did being both make me neither? I wondered. Was that my nationality? Neither? Is that why I was always uncomfortable with myself, with my parents, and also with the Americans?" End quote. Armenian American authors have continued to incorporate themes of genocide into their literature even as their own self-conception of identity is changing. The authors are still exploring their memories and how this affected their identity. The genocide is a recurrent theme inscribed especially in the genre of the novel and is reflected in the literary discourse that dominates English language writing. A little bit later, I compare also more extensively Armenian American literature with other ethnic literatures in America, and that reveals that Armenian literature followed similar trends in the post-1960s period. So I'm not going to talk about that today, but it's an area that I think is important to compare the Armenian experience in America with that of other ethnic groups who also immigrated to America. The third-generation Armenian American writers in English are a product of American culture, but also influenced by Armenian culture. They are part of the Armenian diaspora, and their identity is formulated in a multi-layered format, with many factors affecting identity. Margaret Bedrosian stated, quote, "But what world history seems to have cast as a tiny and unreal footnote to World War I, another tale of a small people obstructing the expansionism of great powers, forms the touchstone of modern Armenian identity," end quote. Her reference is clearly to the genocide, and she asserts, Bedrosian asserts, the importance of that event to modern Armenian identity. The genocide, which erupted during the first years of World War I, is tied to nostalgia of the land that the Armenians once lived upon. It is that land which helped the Armenians maintain their identity in a variety of situations throughout history. An interaction with that land of Armenia, how Armenians see themselves in relation to a perceived homeland in myriad countries where Armenians live, and how also they define outsiders, has also shaped Armenian identity. Without the tie, in some real or metaphorical sense, to land, the village, and the memories of the survivors, it would be difficult for a third or fourth generation Armenian to stay attached to their culture in a diaspora, especially the American one. In conclusion, the third generation Armenian American writers have begun to explore the Armenian genocide from a different perspective. They themselves are one generation even further removed from the genocide, and so their works have a reflective quality as they explore. Armenian American authors have continued to incorporate themes of genocide into their literature, even as their own self-conception of identity is changing. The authors are still exploring their memories and how this has affected their identity. The genocide is a recurrent theme, inscribed especially in the genre of the novel, and is reflected in the literary discourse that dominates English language writing. Thank you.